Okay, good morning or good afternoon. It is week 14. This is the last lecture, recorded lecture. One more in class this week. I think this will be shorter. I usually say that, but I mean it this time. I only have half the board to cover. Most of this is not in the textbook. There's an exception, which is the politics stuff. But chapter 8 is very short. It's actually incomplete because I ran out of time to finish the book. So as I said, it's the third edition of the book, but it continues to get edited and improved, and material gets added to it every semester. So we're here, we're in chapter 8, but I'm not going to talk about chapter 8 until the class on Friday. I just want to talk about 5 aspects of American power. And I don't want you to be confused about the way I started after the midterm exam, rather, not the midterm elections. That did happen recently in the United States, but we'll talk about that on Friday too. I want to talk about these 5 aspects. They're not supposed to cover every aspect of American culture or American power for that matter. It's not like the 5 ideals that I told you about at the beginning of the American section. So don't get confused and make sure you study them separately. But I think this is a nice way to end, especially the recorded lectures, just 5 aspects of American culture, which you probably already are familiar with. I'm just going to break them down for you, and we'll look at the sort of pros and cons, right? So let's just talk about power itself. Often people separate the power of a country, a nation, into soft power and hard power. The soft power is the sort of subtle economic influence and cultural influence of a country. Korea, since this is where we are holding the lectures and where everyone is studying, whether you're Korean or not, Korea's both the hard power and soft power have increased a lot, but I think the soft power is even more remarkable. The things in Korea, like the Korean music and Korean films and Korean dramas and Korean food, for example. There are other things, but those things, when I came to Korea over 15 years ago, I didn't know very much about Korea, and now everybody knows. I would have been, if I had come now, as a 25-year-old come to Korea now, I would have known a lot of things and been specifically interested in Korea. But as it was at the time, there wasn't a lot of awareness or information. I even didn't know where to go in Toronto to go out for dinner. Koreatown was there, but it wasn't really famous. So I went to a fancy restaurant that said they had a Korean menu, but I can tell you, it's nothing like authentic Korean food. Now you can go in Toronto and get Korean food anywhere. If you want your kimchi jjigae, no problem. Anyway, that's what the difference between hard power is. Hard power is essentially military strength, right? The ability to attack and subdue another country or another culture, another nation by military strength. So of course, America has both. And which one is more important? I don't think I can answer that question. A lot of people think that the soft power, the military power, wouldn't be effective without the soft power. So for example, we did mention in class the sort of military disasters, if I'm not using the word too loosely, but Vietnam and most recently Iraq and Afghanistan in particular, where the American effort to change the system and sort of rebuild a nation into the American system to join sort of a democratic, westernized culture failed. And it failed for a lot of reasons, but I think one of the reasons is that the soft power of the American of America was not effective in Vietnam. especially, they, for many reasons, the Southern Vietnamese wanted to be under the American influence, and the Northern Vietnamese did not. And there was a real resistance to being Americanized and being joining a capitalist system, and so they remained communist. South Korea is an example, probably the best example of success of the combination of military strength and soft power working in conjunction in order to help country improve its situation. Now, I said to you as well, initially after the Korean War, there was a long period of, rebuilding, obviously, rebuilding and development in Korea, and the system really wasn't democratic or very Western, but they succeeded nonetheless. But initially, North Korea was ahead in its effort to rebuild and develop. It was only after about 20 years of, constant struggle that South Korea started to take the lead. Both countries were at the bottom of the GDP for the world when the Korean War ended. So, back to America. Anyway, America was involved in those things, and this is what I wrote up here: projecting power. The idea of a standing army is quite different than the way America was. Like I said, remember, America was isolationist. Sorry, cold, just like everybody else. The standing army and the Navy of the United States. If we go back to the Spanish-American War, Theodore Roosevelt, who is not a president that I mentioned, but it's FDR's uncle. So again, one of the reasons FDR became president is because he sort of had these this political pedigree. Right? He was related to a previous president by blood. So you get these families that sort of, they're elected as presidents, but they come back in one form or another, maybe not as presidents, but they're in the system. The Roosevelts, one of the families, the Kennedys, and I mentioned most recently the Bushes, George Bush Sr. and George Bush Jr., both served as president, and the Clintons, and I mean, the Trumps were not directly involved in politics, but we'll see if that continues or not. In my opinion, hopefully not, but that's American politics. We'll talk about that in a bit. The standing army of America was very small, and you wouldn't even call it a standing army, really. When they joined World War I, they had to ramp up everything. They had to recruit, and the same thing for almost every conflict. Even Vietnam, they had to recruit and conscript, right? There was a draft, and that was one of the things that, broke the sort of political movement and the support of the American people for Vietnam, was that they didn't want to be drafted and to fight in Southeast Asia in the jungle, because they didn't feel like that was where they should be fighting, that it was a waste of human life and resources, and that it wasn't in American interests. That was the real reason why they ended up losing the war. And they did lose the war, no matter what people say. They didn't lose it sort of militarily, they lost it because they lost support. If you're in a democratic country and the majority of the people don't support the war, then you can't sustain the war. The president or the legislature is going to lose their majority, and somebody else is going to be elected who wants to get them out of the war, and then they will. That's how democratic nations work. So this idea that America has a huge standing army, a big military, lots of soldiers, lots of equipment standing by all the time, or in military bases training all the time, they never had that, and they didn't want that. Even George Washington didn't really want an army around, and a lot of Americans still are very nervous about, for example, giving up their guns. So we'll talk about this on Friday, just because they feel like if the army is used against them, they need to have defense. They need to be able to defend themselves, not just individually or against the police or against other neighbors, but they need to be able to take up arms to fight against anybody who threatens their liberty, right? Now, I'm not saying that's the right attitude, but that's where it comes from. So now they have a huge military, but the reality, I think, is that having a gun, no matter what kind of gun it is not going to be able to help you fight against the American military. They have too much technology, too much training, too much power, and there's too many of them for any civilian group to resist against them if they were to decide that they wanted to take over. That's also against American cultural precedent that the military would have any involvement in a political process. You're supposed to keep those things separate. Religion and politics and military should always remain separate. If you start mixing somebody's a general and a religious leader and the head of state, you've got an autocrat, right? Like some countries have. So one of the things though about this problem about how much military spending happens and how much how important the military is to the United States is that there is a relationship between American industry. A lot of American industry has moved out, right, of America. For example, the auto industry moved to Mexico, and most of the computer chips and phones, for example, iPhones or any other computer hardware, stuff like that, chips, all that stuff is made in China or Vietnam or Mexico or other countries. But the military stuff, America's still world leader and it's still made in America. For example, Lockheed Martin makes jet fighters, right? Supersonic jets and stealth fighters, and there's still Boeing, right? Still makes bombers and commercial aircraft. Part of that is because the budget for the military is huge. It's to pay this huge standing army and this navy, but it's also investment in companies and technologies. And there's a connection between, like, if the government stops putting money into the military, then there'll be like an economic collapse. And this entanglement of the free market and private companies and the military and the government is something that Eisenhower, I mentioned Dwight Eisenhower, he was president at the end of the Korean War. He's the one who stopped it. And he was a general and he was the high commander, and he was the secretary of NATO when he became president. So he was very aware of this troubling entanglement or relationship, which would be difficult to, excuse me. Yeah, that cold. That would be difficult. I'm not going to restart the video. I'm just going to keep going. Excuse me. That connection between the military and the government was problematic. But and he warned when he stepped down after his second term. He warned that this is going to be a problem, and we should consider how much investment should be put into the military, because it's going to be difficult to dismantle that system. So you got power projection. Power projection means to push, send your power all over the place. Some of that is in the form of actual military bases. This is more like hard power than soft power. For example, there are military bases in Korea. There's military bases in Germany and in Japan. One of the famous military bases in Okinawa. They have them all over the world, and they do training exercises. And everybody knows, especially recently because of the war between Ukraine and Russia, that NATO is originally only a handful of countries that agreed. The North Atlantic Treaty Organization agreed to form this bloc, Western European Northern Atlantic Treaty, of which Canada, my country, and US and United Kingdom were the primary movers in the beginning. And France didn't join initially, but gradually almost the majority of the Western European countries, including Germany, are very important to that alliance system. And it keeps getting bigger, and that's one of the reasons that Russia and China don't like the United States per se is this idea that NATO is just going to keep expanding until it includes the entire world. Okay, I'm not saying that's true, but it might be explain some of the concern that other powerful countries have when they're surrounded by other countries that are all allied against them. Technology. There's all kinds of inventions. That's actually one of the ideals is this experimentation. Computers, communications, the biggest companies in the United States now, Google, Facebook, Tesla. Tesla is not doing so hot, but that's mostly because of the Twitter, fiasco. But all of these companies show, for example, the innovation of the United States. I'm not saying these days they dominate technology. Chinese technology is catching up, or in some places exceeded them. But all these social networking things, Facebook, Instagram, the internet services like Google, all of those networking systems. Originally, they did come from military technology usually, and they were adapted. Obviously, in terms of weapons, the United States is still one of the premier countries, if not, I would say they're still, I don't know, nobody knows for sure, but they're at the leading edge of technological innovation for military purposes. So weapons are certainly an aspect of American culture you cannot deny. The politics. Now I'm going to talk about this in class in more detail, but bicameral legislature, I think I messed up my S a little bit there, but when you elect people, there's a Senate, it's an upper house, and there's a lower house. The main thing you need to know is that each state sends representatives to Congress, and they do it by population. In the Senate, each state sends 2 senators, so it doesn't matter how big the state is. For example, population-wise, Alaska's huge, it's the biggest state, but population-wise, it's small. So they only send a few representatives to the lower house, to the legislature, but they send 2 senators, just like California, which is kind of weird for other democracies to imagine that Rhode Island and Alaska and Hawaii and a few other small population countries, states, might be able to block something being passed through legislature. You can't do that. You can't do that in United Kingdom, for example. They still have the House of Lords, the upper house, and they still have the House of Commons, the lower house. But the House of Lords is not allowed to block the lower house's legislation proposals for laws. They're only allowed to review them. That power was taken away a long time ago. So the American upper house can still block. They can still, if they have a majority, if the other party has a majority, or the Senate decides that they don't like the law, then they can block it. So that's problematic for any president if they don't have control of both the houses. And right now, Joe Biden has control of I think he has, I think it's a tie in the Senate. It's 50-50 when they vote, but there's that gives the president's party the advantage because they get a tiebreaker vote. So he has control of the Senate, but the lower house, he does not. He's got a minority in the lower house. So when the president sends something to the lower house, it's probably going to get stopped right there before it even gets to the upper house. Originally, there was no party system. As I mentioned, at the very beginning, there was the president got elected, and number 2, the second person in terms of votes, was vice president. But after George Washington, that quickly became a problem, that the vice president and the president were not on the same page. So they changed that so that the president and the vice president were on the same ticket. And if you voted for the president, you got whoever was the vice president too. Sometimes that's a big factor if the president chooses a vice president who's not popular or not well liked or not effective. So that developed into this 2-party system. Like I said, there's been different parties, but the modern Republican Party, it traces itself back to Abraham Lincoln, although it's changed a lot. And the Democratic system, the Democrat the Democrats were originally Democratic Republicans, but they dropped that part and they became oriented around the South in their early days. But then, as I said, they flipped and became the People's Party, and the Republicans became the Conservative Party. So those parties have existed in one form and another for 150 years or so. There's three branches in the government. There's the legislative branch, the executive branch, and this is something that's in the book and on my slides, which I will show you. I'm sure some of you will snap pictures. But memorizing isn't the most important thing here. You just need to know the main ideas, and you have to be able to explain it, right? You have to be able to write sentences, especially stuff like this. Like, think of the big picture here. Think about doing a 5-point question and trying to answer using your knowledge of the whole thing, not, name the aspects of politics. Is it A, B, C, or D, or E? Anyway, the three branches are supposed to balance each other like a triangle. You got the president is the executive branch, and including the vice president, and they have executive control. They make the decisions. The legislative branch is the elected people from across the country who represent the will of the people and pass laws. And the judicial branch is the judges, the Supreme Court, of which there are 9, and they make judgments on whether something is constitutional or not. So if there is a disagreement between states and federal courts, or national government and state government, or there's something the president does, which they have to determine, is it legal or illegal. That's the arena of the Supreme Court, the judicial branch. Okay, campaigning. I think this is for me, this is the biggest problem. Is like American politics uses up so much time, money, and resources. It's ridiculous. As soon as a president gets elected, they settle in for like 6 months, and then it's time to start campaigning for the next election. They start campaigning 2 years before it happens. Donald Trump just announced right after the midterms were over. He announced he's running for president in 2 years. Is it time to announce that you're running for president 2 years before? I mean, you're starting to raise money already. I think he's going to take some of that money for himself. But even if he doesn't, it just means that there's a huge amount of money being pumped into the system, and that the person who gets the most money is going to win. Barack Obama, when he got elected the first time, he got a huge amount of money compared to John McCain, his Republican counterpart. Most of it from small donors. A lot of people gave $10 or $20. It wasn't, huge amounts of money from rich people. But when he campaigned, he raised way more money than John McCain did, and maybe he was going to win anyway. But that was one of the major factors. And as I said, I liked Obama, but that's not the way you should get into the House. That's not the way you should get into the White House, by having more money, no matter where it comes from. That's my opinion. Anyway, that's the way it works. Campaigning is like a permanent thing. So yeah, midterms were done. Campaigning for halfway through the presidency was done. Immediately, people are saying, "I'm going to run for president." 2 years later. No, it's a continuous, unbroken cycle. Commercially, America has been dominant. A lot of the, excuse me for a moment. Excuse me. A lot of the commerce of the United States stems from its military relationships that were formed after World War II. But America was an industrial powerhouse, like I said. Just the amount of resources and space and the influx of people and the combination of this free market economy and the demand. I mean, they were overproducing. They had a problem with demand often in American markets because they end up having too much stuff, and this causes an economic slump and prices go down. Currently, we have an inflation problem, which means we don't have enough stuff. But frequently in American history, we've had a deflation problem because America is just capable of producing too much. McDonald's and Coca-Cola are representative companies. These are franchises. Sorry, McDonald's is a franchise, so it depends on the country though. But most recently, McDonald's pulled out of Russia because of the condition, the relationship, the economic relationship, sanctions. It's problematic for running a business there. But McDonald's is everywhere. It's in every country. It's in more countries than the American military is. So, that's a perfect example of soft power. People drinking Coke and buying McDonald's, no matter what airport they're in the world. Usually there's a McDonald's there, and that's usually what I eat. I don't eat McDonald's normally, but when I fly, I'm starving. It's a very convenient thing to grab a cheeseburger from McDonald's to tide you over until you get that terrible airplane food. Depending on which flight, if you're flying Korean Air, usually the food's pretty good. So all these products, obviously vehicles are very famous in America and abroad. Germany and Japan have, entered the car business long ago, and some people prefer their brands, but it was, as I mentioned, it was Henry Ford in the assembly line and General Motors that in the early 20th century, 50% of all cars were in the United States, and it became a global trend, which now, of course, everybody should have the opportunity to have a car and drive it, but that's played a huge role in the damage to our environment. Consumption also. Americans and any country that imitates the American system and becomes capitalist, we tend to consume way more resources than anybody in other countries, developing countries, or even, countries that are developed would have different systems. China and Japan being good examples, I think. In some sense, Japan has definitely followed America, but their consumption levels are much lower. They don't use as much energy, and they're much better about space and overconsumption and waste. Much better than the United States, probably because they have a smaller country and they have other things to worry about, for example, natural disasters. But nonetheless, there's a big difference between the American economy is driven by American consumption and importing. That's why everybody wants to trade with America, because they will buy your stuff. If you make good stuff, they will buy it. Okay, I can't blame that one on my nose. The final category is arts and entertainment, and I originally just said entertainment, but some of these things are on the border of art. I'm not talking about, we didn't really talk about paintings, or we talked about literature a little bit. Don't forget Chaucer or Shakespeare or Mark Twain or Jane Austen or Charles Dickens. I did mention them in passing because they sort of captured the culture of their time. But other than Mark Twain, we haven't really talked about any Americans. Obviously, in terms of cartoons, the giant there is Walt Disney, and comics, Marvel is Stan Lee, who passed away not that long ago, only a few years ago. The novels that came after Huckleberry Finn, probably the writer that I identify with the most in terms of mid-century America is Ernest Hemingway, who wrote about World War II and wrote about existentialism and largely like male experience of living life and trying to find meaning in this modern world. He's simple to read and not that complicated, but the ideas certainly are. So I would highly recommend Ernest Hemingway, For Whom the Bell Tolls or Farewell to Arms. Those are, The Sun Also Rises. Those are a few of his books. If you care to check them out, they're a good read. And obviously television, we got Netflix, very popular. streaming service, and Disney Plus and everything followed that. Before that, we had movies and video rentals. There was, I like to sometimes show a picture of Blockbuster Video, which was everywhere when I was young, all over the place. Every city had one. This is as common as McDonald's. And then we stopped renting videos, and the whole thing collapsed. It's sort of like the film, like photography industry. There used to be a film, Kodak. I know they've sort of transformed their company and they still exist, but that was an essential service, was to develop film for pictures for a long time. And then suddenly everything went digital, and all of those film developing places closed down. So American music is very popular in various forms. Everybody knows Michael Jackson. Everybody knows Elvis. That's the king of rock and roll, and the king of pop. Sports. American sports is on a different level. The EPL and the Spanish La Liga have teams and leagues that are the size and the amount of money that the American sports leagues are. But really, that's one of the most important points out of all of this stuff. Is like, I did explain to you that the first NFL game was played in Germany about a month ago, maybe less than a month ago, and they played in Bayern Munich's stadium, which is the biggest, most expensive. So it's basically a German powerhouse soccer team, and they filled the stadium with Germans who were wearing NFL gear and love American football and can sing American songs. John Denver and Take Me Home Country Roads being the song that they performed. As a fan, as spectators, the whole stadium sang it together. That's soft power again. Football is still dominated by American teams and players, and but we'll see. The big five are basketball, football, ice hockey, baseball, and the fifth one is arguable, soccer, or football, as you like to call it in Europe. Those sports usually, with the exception of American soccer, football, those leagues, if you want to play those sports, you want to make a lot of money and become famous, and you want to play against the best in the world, you have to go to the United States. That's why all of the best Canadian talents, whatever they're in, whatever field they're in, arts and entertainment, sports, television, creative stuff, cartoons, screenwriting. If you're Canadian, you go to the States, you end up in California or New York or somewhere else where you can, be more successful and make more money. That's the way it is. That's the relationship between Canada and the United States. Now, you notice I didn't talk about education and some other things. So these are just samples of a few aspects of American culture that I think are important. And I can't breathe because of my nose. So I'm sorry about the quality of the speech today, but this is our last lecture, so we're almost there. One more hour this Friday should do it, and I'll answer any questions about exam review, and then the exam is the only thing remaining. So have a good week, and I'll see you on Friday.